Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space, my four walls right here in the wood of the holly, under the sign overlooking the not-so-COVID-addled land of law. Welcome, one and all. I have an incredibly special guest today. This gentleman is, well, he's a native of Berkeley. He is a longtime rock and roll columnist from the San Francisco Chronicle. And if you're into music, specifically rock and roll, you've probably already read him in the Rolling Stones and countless other publications. He's written a ton of books on rock and roll, Altamont, and most importantly, the culture that it spawned, particularly right here on the West Coast. And he's just out with his latest book, which he kindly gave to me courtesy of a mutual friend. It's called Hollywood Eden, Electric Guitars, Fast Cars, and the Myth of the California Paradise. Welcome to Rebel Without Applause, Joel Selvin. How are you?
Hey, Bill. How you doing?
Great to see you. Thanks for joining me. Now, just looking at the cover, I was misinformed because I didn't realize that the California Paradise was actually a myth. I thought it was real. I've been trying to live it my whole life, and now I've discovered it's a myth. Who knew?
Well, it's like so many of our commonly held dreams, something that doesn't matter how scuffed up and kicked around and beaten down it is, it stays there. It lives in our shared subconscious as Americans, as global citizens. I mean, this California thing is recognized the world round. Ah, you're from California, you know. I remember going to the hash bar in Amsterdam, and the guy said, you from America? I go, no, I'm from California. He goes, California, let me give you this then. Okay.
I was in Morocco last year, and I went, or now the year before last, and I go, I'm from Hollywood. So, you know, that's a global place too, all part of it. Strangely, your book is about not typically Hollywood, but more the state of mind of Hollywood, because its point of origin is in a very specific place. It starts in one high school on the west side of LA, just slightly west of the 405 freeway, University High.
Well, it starts before there was a 405 freeway.
Yes, probably was. And now to me that
it was. 405 freeway doesn't open until like 61, 62.
Right. So
and this is 1958 when the intersection of Sunset and Sepulveda was a four-way stop sign.
Right. Well, today the 405 for people that live in that area, which is Brentwood, where my brother lives, they never go east. It might as well be the Mexican border. I mean, it is sort of an island on the land, as a famous author once called California. What about this little space in time and place attracted you?
Somebody showed me the University High School yearbook from 1958. And there's Jan, Dean, Nancy Sinatra, Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys, Kim Fowley, the record producer, Sandy Nelson, the drummer at Gidget, our friend Kathy. And I didn't realize that all these people had gone to school together and knew each other. And it coalesced right away in my mind that this was kind of a seed moment. And it wasn't very far for me to be able to like see a straight through line to like the summer of 1966 when Dan has his car crash, Nancy has Boots Are Made for Walking, and Brian makes Good Vibrations. It just seemed like a highway led them there. And it starts in the locker room of University High after football practice with a bunch of the football players singing doo-wop songs. It really does.
It was sort of an age of innocence because all of it, you know, lives before the Vietnam War, which in my view changed everything.
I wanted to write about the journey from complete innocence to self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to go on into what happens after the self-knowledge is attained. I wanted to take the story and end it where everything had been summed up, but the consequences hadn't really been fully felt. I didn't want to follow brain-damaged Jan Berry through his adult life.
I don't blame you.
Brian Wilson. I wanted to leave these guys whole and emerging from their story. But yeah, it starts out with everybody naked. I mean, this is a book about how you lose innocence and what happens. It's Eden.
And what was interesting to me, having lived in LA, is how each high school has its own specific culture, and University High, I know, has its own specific culture. Firstly, as was all the public schools in LA, it was very segregated. It was very white in the 50s. It wouldn't be till much later that it started to change. It was on the border of the Hollywood community, so you had, like you say, sons and daughters of celebrities and movie people. It was UCLA adjacent, so a lot of professors' children went there, or people in the professors, upwardly mobile engineer families from the aerospace businesses that were blossoming all over Southern California. Actually, more so probably in the South Bay, but still they were there. So this is what I still feel it when I go to Brentwood. My brother lives in Mandeville Canyon. It's the WPL. It's white people land. And I live here under the Hollywood sign, and Hollywood High is right below where I live, not far. And has a total different identity.
In the book, the University High kids are contrasted with the Fairfax High kids. Phil Spector,
Right.
Steve Douglas, the sax player, and a little bit before their time was Herb Alpert. And they come out of this more culturally diverse, highly Jewish culture in Fairfax High. And yeah, I mean, you want a perfect example of how of what the University High culture was Jan Berry. He lived on the absolute peak of the Bel Air Hills, and his backyard overlooked the canyon that would eventually be 405. And his
Kenter.
father was
Kenter.
Howard Hughes's right-hand man. He was in the cockpit with Hughes when they flew the Spruce Goose.
Right.
He lived a block up the hill from Bruce Johnston. He was a couple years younger, but Bruce's father ran the Rexall drug chain, and their next door neighbor was Burt Lancaster. That's the demographics of University High and they were the elite of all elites. And in this post-war baby boom generation, they had no sense of deprivation. They had no limits on their optimism. All things in life were possible to these kids, which is why they were able to do what they did.
And then, of course, they had their own private racetrack right there called Sunset Boulevard, which took them right to the sea.
Jan Berry, wrote and sang Dead Man's Curve.
He ate it on Whittier Boulevard, and as you described it, it's probably right in front of Bugsy Siegel's old house where he was offed, which was on Whittier Boulevard. What was your take on that music? I mean, I think the Beach Boys really took it to like a level that was beautiful and artistic and eternal. I'm not so sure I feel the same way about Jan and Dean.
So I think most people look at Jan and Dean as Beach Boys imitators.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's more like the other way around. When Brian put that first Beach Boys record together, Surfin', in 1962, it was strongly reminiscent of the 1959.
Is this the record?
Well, that's Surfer Girl, but Surfin' was on a small label called Candix Records.
Okay.
And it was before they came to the attention of Capitol Records. I mean, Capitol Records was this monolithic tower of square music of Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra. They didn't do no rock and roll.
Right.
But Brian drew very heavily from the 1959 Jan and Dean record Baby Talk, and doing Surfin'. It wasn't that Jan and Dean were a one-hit act in Los Angeles. And as far as the rest of the country, they hadn't really followed up on the Baby Talk success. But all their records were played on the radio in Los Angeles. They were a regional favorite. And they had this very strong doo-wop derived style that Brian borrowed in making that first record. Jan and Dean recognized it the first time they heard the record on the radio. The guy that worked at the record distributorship and actually named the group the Beach Boys, he recognized it as a Jan and Dean knockoff. It was easy. So then they meet up. Jan and Brian meet up, and that's sort of an epic moment. The Beach Boys are two records into their career, but they're still playing sock hops in the neighborhood. And they're backing up Jan and Dean at some Thursday night school sock hop at a junior high down in Hermosa Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this whole thing about the surf music, and Jan and Dean, who actually do surf as opposed to Brian and his family, are quite taken by the whole idea of surf music. So they convinced Brian to bring the Beach Boys in the studio and back Jan and Dean on some album tracks, recording Brian's songs. First time anybody else has recorded Brian's songs. And at this point, Brian's made 2 records, and Jan has made a dozen. He's made an album. I mean, he's a KG veteran, and Brian's a newcomer. So they get together to write songs. Brian tosses off this line at him, 2 girls for every boy. And Jan knows how to make that into a song. He employs a couple of associates, and they come up with this song. And they go into the studio, and he brings Brian with him. And Brian plays on that record. Brian sings on that record. And Brian learns how to stack harmony vocals in the studio. Jan shows him how to use session musicians on the tracks. But Jan's very much a mentor to Brian Wilson at this early stage in his career. And needless to say, Brian grew and developed into this extraordinary figure in modern music. But Jan Berry was the guy who sort of held his hand in through the doorway. And Brian stayed involved in Jan and Dean music throughout their career. He's a co-author of A Dead Man's Curve. He actually started the song. Mm-hmm. And he's singing and playing and writing on Jan and Dean records as late as like Ride the Wild Surf. So this connection is not quite what it seems, you know. But Jan and Dean weren't literally like, you know, tailgating along the Beach Boys, but they were actually like creative collaborators that worked in concert together. A lot of my books deal with this whole idea of how community creates culture.
Cross-pollination, because actually Uni High wasn't that far from Hawthorne. Well, it's a short drive down this Sepulveda Boulevard, and they could be at each other's houses in a heartbeat. It's not
that. Yeah,
that
but it was a million miles culturally.
The Beach Boys neighborhood is way more working class, way more people that were like, I think, in aerospace, working in factories.
Well, Murray Wilson was a sheet metal factory worker.
When people think of surf music, they think of course, the Beach Boys, and to me, they're the most beautiful expression of it, and Jan and Dean. But I play the clarinet. I'm a jazz guy. And surf music, its original incarnation, was played by the jazz guys. Art Pepper had an album called Surf Ride. That was
that was that whole South Bay jazz thing, right? The Lighthouse and all that. And before the rock and roll thing, the West Coast jazz was associated with the bohemian lifestyle. Now, I have this whole theory, Bill, about surfers that emerged in the Los Angeles area, and that whole culture that started brewing in the late part of the 50s and the West Coast, being very parallel to what happened in San Francisco with beatniks. Beatniks were nonconformists. They rejected conventional society. They had their own wardrobe. They had their own language. And that way they mirrored what was going on in Southern California, although it was taking on among the surfers is more outdoors, more athletic.
Right.
But the basic premise that these people were outliers, volunteer outliers that were rejecting the norms of society to pursue their own ideals, their own values, that's what they had in common.
Surfing, I mean, I wrote a script about it. It's called Paradise Cove, about a guy in the early 50s, and he can't put a suit on anymore. He was like a top South Bay surfer, and he goes and he shacks up or camps out with his pals up on Point Doom, and one of them is a jazz musician, another one's a dime store kind of novelist, but they're basically at the point of a very small cultural spear, and just like you said, you're totally spot on in recognizing that. Is before Jan and Dean and the gidgetization of surfing was very much in alignment with the beat culture. But then, of course, one of our mutual friends comes along, Kathy, and her father memorializes her in Gidget, and all of a sudden surfing explodes into the popular culture, and it's no longer the property of these beat kind of dudes.
Los Angeles in the 50s, even like I said, it's a couple dozen small villages that were connected by these long, broad boulevards. And they all developed their unique sort of way of being and their style and everything.
Another person I wanted to mention in this sort of pre-rock thing is Bud Shank, who was a pretty popular jazz guy, and he scored Slippery When Wet and these Bruce Brown documentaries that actually preceded Endless Summer.
I don't remember those having scores. I remember him doing them with live bands.
Well, I just
Bud
bought,
Shank, by the way, is the guy that plays the flute solo on California Dreamin'.
right. So these session players, yes, but I'll show you. I have the records. I just bought them today. I said, I wonder if I could find those scores from Ride the Wild Surf, and I was able to, and they were available.
I remember going to see Bruce Brown at very small auditoriums where he narrated it live. He stood and watched the screen. He stood in front of
And
the
just
screen
talked
watched
about it.
and just sat there and said, "Now here's what's happening." And yeah, they had some like sort of band off in the corner playing the soundtrack.
Yeah,
live.
so this Barefoot Adventure, this was a surf doc, Bud Shank, and then there was another one. I used to watch these movies. I call it surf porn.
He used to just show these 16 millimeter things in halls around the state.
Right. I want to talk about their trip to Central Avenue when they meet John Dolphin, which in Central Avenue, for those of you that aren't aware, was really the cultural center of black life in Los Angeles from the late 40s into the early to mid 50s, probably on its downturn by the time those guys got there. But rhythm and blues, Johnny Otis, a whole entrepreneurial, very lively cross-cultural thing was happening on Central Avenue, and the main record store there was Dolphins of Hollywood, and you describe a very scary event there.
Well, of course, the record store, open 24 hours, 7 days a week, was in South Central. But Dolphin kept offices in downtown on South Bernardo. That's where the record company offices were.
Okay, yeah, Berendo.
Thank you. And so he ran into these white kids in a recording studio in Hollywood, and he was like kind of interested in doing some business with them because he'd been noticing this whole thing about white kids showing up at his South Central record store to buy these R&B records, and thought maybe there was something in it for him. So he has them come down to his office and meet them, and that's where a disgruntled vocalist bursts into the office and interrupts the meeting by shooting Dolphin 5 times. And this is the first day in the record business for Sandy Nelson, Bruce Johnston, Dave Shostak, and Arthur Wright, who were in this band that Dolphin was interested in. It didn't seem to deter their interest in the music business, although I'm not sure I wouldn't, thought about it.
Yeah, so they witnessed the actual
They were in the office. Bruce had to pick up the body off it had been blown down on a heater, and Bruce picked him up and said, "Mr. Dolphin, are you all right?" I mean, and Bruce is like 15, 16 years old.
Now, I met Mike Dolphin, his son. He used to hang out at some of the music places I played, and he talked to me about it. And one of the things that's so interesting to me, we don't think about this today. I mean, the record business, I don't even understand. But very often the record stores were also recording. You had that kind of synergy between the guy who sold the records and the guy who made the records. They're one and the same in many cases.
Dolphin, like you said, was a community center, and he used the front window as a disc jockey booth, and a lot of guys broadcast their shows out of Dolphins, and then they'd have interviews, and artists would come in and be in the window, and it was a constant flow of people. He also operated a number of labels himself, and who knew really better what was selling than some guy who was running a record store. And
right.
I think he started out in the late 40s, early 50s. He's a really proud, smart-ass guy, Dolphin. He called his shop Dolphins of Hollywood, although it's in South Central. But at that time, he couldn't have rented a store in Hollywood if his life depended on it.
Forget about it.
He decided just, to hell with him. I'm in Hollywood. And he did the same thing with his record labels. And I think he had some success with Percy Mayfield early on. And he had a really pretty big record with Ernie Freeman called Jivin' Around, I think 54, 55. Ernie would go on to be a really important session player in Los Angeles. And so he always had his hand in, with this label, that label. And there were no real discrete barriers between radio stations, record companies, and recording artists in those days. Wasn't very big money, wasn't a very big deal. There wasn't a lot of interest. It was mostly just, kids and black people. So, how could that matter?
Yeah, and it was beautiful cross-cultural kind of exchange. Of course, the cops became very brutal on these neighborhoods. They did not like the cross-cultural thing going on, and it starts this or continues this narrative of police brutality on black neighborhoods. Another guy who also was part of the jazz world was Ross Russell, who started Dial Records and also was a novelist or a biographer of Charlie Parker. I don't believe he had a record store. He might have.
Pretty good book. He had the Dial Records label,
Right.
and did produced Charlie's great masterpieces, and then spent many, many years working on that book. That's really one of the great pieces of jazz literature.
Yes. Another one is Straight Time, that biography by Art
This has
Pepper.
been one of my pandemic hobbies is plowing through jazz autobiographies. There's a bunch of them, and Count Basie and Ellington did them. If you want to read the jazz autobiographies, and I'm reading it, I love the information, I love the knowledge, but what I'm really soaking up is the locution, the vocabulary, and the rhythm. Barnett is totally drenched in 30s hipster talk. And of course, the best one of those is the Mezz Mezzrow book, right? Mezz Mezzrow, who was not a very good player, but he was everybody's pot dealer. So he knew everybody. And and his book is just drenched in hipster English of the 30s. It's got some of the most beautiful locution and dialogue that of any of these jazz books. And I can read it for just that alone. But yeah, no, really the Blues by Mezz Mezzrow. Dial it up. It's your next book. You got it.
Okay. I'll tell you, the book that blew me away, it was part of my research for when I wrote Central Avenue, was Straight Time, because it really paints a very vivid picture of LA and Central Avenue and Art Pepper scuffling to make that scene and his challenges, and then he becomes a criminal. He becomes a drug dealer and a burglar. I mean, it's an incredible book.
Well, he was practically proud of how much junk he shot in that book. It was a little grimy. There's a Johnny Otis book, which is very, very hard to find, called "Listen to the Lambs," and that you want to read about Central Avenue in the 40s. Check out Johnny Otis's book.
Well, another thing I wanted to throw at you is, and you mentioned Johnny Otis, which is the perfect cue, is how those rhythm and blues guys that were making the scene in Central Avenue enriched, informed this emerging beach music, this surf music.
Not only that, and obviously the original inspiration for all these musicians was in the R&B field, and especially for some reason in the vocal group sound of the era. You can hear the strains of doo-wop in all the Beach Boys records.
Right.
What's really true, Bill, is that Los Angeles had a very thriving Black rhythm and blues recording scene, operating out of Imperial Records and modern Kent and RPM Records, and a whole host of local labels that were, featuring producers like Fred Smith, who had the Olympics, and Bob and Earl, and it was very thriving. And this white music that came in and took over the Los Angeles recording scene starting about 1962 kind of put the cap on the growth of the Black scene in Los Angeles, kind of snuffed it out in many ways. It certainly led to the end of Imperial Records. By 1966, it had been sold, and Modern and Kent had really gone downhill. By that time, they were almost exclusively selling B.B. King records and not much else. It's funny how, like, not only did they draw all that inspiration, and indeed, like the session that Kim Fowley conducted in 1960 to produce this pivotal record in the Los Angeles rock and roll history of Alley-Oop by the Hollywood Argyles, was only white people on top. It was Black people on the bottoms. It was Gaynell Hodge on piano from the Platters. The track was all the rhythm and blues musicians, and the guys shouting on top were the white rock and roll musicians. And that was this pivotal moment, and it's emblematic of what happened, because there wasn't much of a Los Angeles rhythm and blues scene after 1965.
Another recording artist, or not artist, well, he was a recording artist, but he also had a record company, and he was a friend of mine. I knew him right until he died, was Bob Keane, who gets some mention in your book. I think he was Richie Valens'. He was He always was very nice to me because we both loved the clarinet. I played the clarinet, he played the clarinet. So when I would play, he was always, way to go, bro, way to go. And I was pleased to see that he got some mention, and he was in the mix here as well as one of these.
He was in on the founding of the label Keen Records with the Simus brothers who financed it. But
Okay.
he split ways very soon with them and started his own Delphi Records, which is where Richie Valens recorded.
Okay.
And it was a short-lived enterprise, but he managed to milk that for many, many, many years.
I'll tell you another character that, he just recently died, was Phil Spector, and you paint a very interesting arc of his life. I think he went to Fairfax High too.
Yep.
Jewish kid scuffling, some psychic scars that aren't altogether clear, and then he just kind of flips out into his own world.
Well, in Hollywood Eden, Spector's an important figure, although he's not really ever present in the narrative. He is involved with the University High kids while he's at Fairfax High, and makes his own first hit record the summer after high school. And pretty soon thereafter, he leaves town for New York because
Right.
that's where the music business is. And he was very ambitious to make it in the music business. You wouldn't think you could in Los Angeles in 1958 make it in the music business.
Mm-hmm.
But he comes back, and in 1962, he has to have kind of an emergency recording session in Los Angeles. He wants to record a song, and he hears that somebody else is going to record a version of this song, so he has to hurry up and record it. So he calls his Fairfax High classmate, Steve Douglas, who's a saxophone player, went in on the road with Duane Eddy after high school, and is now back in town playing recording sessions on these R&B records that you're talking about. And Spector says, well, I need to get a bunch of guys together for a session. So Steve pulls together this group of musicians. It's Hal Blaine on drums, it's Al DeLore on keyboards, it's Tommy Tedesco on guitar. And they cut the track for what would be a #1 hit for Phil Spector's group, the Crystals, called He's a Rebel. And this is the moment where this group of musicians comes together for the first time, who will form the pool of studio musicians that have come to be known as the Wrecking Crew.
Right.
And these are the musicians who made everything possible. And they were so different from anybody that came before. Before, all the rock and roll records were made with like big band jazz guys that were slumming, or R&B guys picking up a few bucks. And everybody's looking down their nose at this music they're making, white teenager. But these guys, they were rock and roll musicians. They came to the studio wearing blue jeans and T-shirts, and they were on the inside of this music. So they were going to make capable all the work of Brian Wilson and Jan and Dean and Lou Adler and so many other people that were going to make records in Los Angeles. And the edge that they were going to have over New York and London and Chicago and all these others is they had these guys in the studio with them. And so many of them went on to become, figures and in their own right, Glenn Campbell, Leon Russell, it was just a phenomenal pool of talent. And they more than anything made possible what was going to happen in Los Angeles starting in 1962. Because by 1965, Los Angeles was the recording capital of the world.
And wasn't Reprise also a pretty important piece in that? You mentioned Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, and that crew.
Terry Melcher got a job producing records at Columbia Records. He really started out thinking he might like to be a singer. And since he was Doris Day's kid, no sweat, have a shot at it.
Right.
She was not only one of the biggest stars on Columbia Records, she was also one of the biggest stockholders. So he quickly got channeled into sort of like, why don't you produce records for us? And Columbia was very behind the 8 ball. The head of their A&R was Mitch Miller, and he kept expecting rock and roll to die any minute.
Mitch Miller, sing along with Mitch.
That's my man. He produced all those Tony Bennett and Frank Sinatra records and all that crud that Columbia had sold in the 50s.
He's also on Parker with Strings on the
played oboe.
Oboe, right? Yeah.
He was no square. He just didn't see rock and roll. He didn't have the feel for it at all. He had a blind spot. But so they've been off the charts for years. And Terry Melcher working out of the remote outpost of Los Angeles for Columbia Records. I mean, in New York, Columbia Records is in, Black Rock, right?
Right.
And Skyscraper and Goddard Lieberson, the most white gloved guy in the record business is the president. Out here, it's just a funky little 3-story building. And so Melcher starts turning out like mid-chart records with a vocal group called the Ripcords. And, it's like, hey, what have we got going here? And that's about the same time that he hooks up with Bruce Johnston, who's been playing on records and being a part of this Los Angeles rock and roll scene since he was on piano in Jan Berry's garage in 1958. And he's already produced Richie Valens albums, written and arranged R&B hits, recorded his own albums, and he's had so much experience, and he's not 20 years old. So he joins up, and the two of them become the Columbia A&R department in the West Coast. And that means they start out by just singing everybody's parts on the record and just taking over as if they were the producers and writers. And they started having hits. And they were doing car songs. They were doing Beach Boys imitations.
Yeah.
And it worked for a couple of years until, Bruce got involved in joining the Beach Boys. And that's also about the time that this folk rock thing starts happening. And Terry, he produced Mr. Tambourine Man with the Byrds and sort of set that whole ball rolling. He probably would have been very influential throughout the 60s in the Los Angeles record business if his stepfather, Marty Melcher, hadn't died and everybody discovered that he'd embezzled almost the entire fortune of Doris Day. So Terry left the record business to sort of like restore his mother's career, and that's where that TV show that she did came from, and
Right.
that. And he never really got back into the record business in any satisfying way.
Now, of course, he somewhat infamously becomes the object of Charles Manson's, presumably, I don't know, there's some doubts about that, but that Manson, who had some musical ambitions, approached him and was rejected, and some had believed that was the basis for the murder, because he lived in that house. Melcher lived in the house that Sharon Tate and Polanski eventually moved into.
So you know what I'm really proud of, Bill? I'm really proud of the fact that I've written a book about Los Angeles in the 60s that doesn't mention Charlie Manson.
Well, by the way, there's been some books that have just covered it very recently. That Tom Watson book about Chinatown, and your book actually sits in a nice genre with Ron Lowenstein's Rock Me on the Water, The Big Goodbye about Chinatown, the last years of Hollywood. Central Avenue Sounds, which is a great book by Steve Iswardi, mostly interviews. And then another guy who I interviewed, who I consider one of the giants, and I think your book fits very nicely in this whole sort of canvas, is Mike Davis, who wrote City of Courts, and then most recently, what's that book called? We Set the Night on Fire, which is...
Oh yeah, his 60s. Well, he's pretty much the guy right now about writing about Los Angeles.
City of Courts was really helped me understand the place I live, and we had a chat in the middle of the whole COVID thing, but I really enjoyed it. And then there's another book to me, which is sort of we get into Southern California history. It's called An Island on the Land by Carrie McWilliams, and it's a fantastic historical piece about Southern California, which leads in, he even describes my apartment building, because I live in a place called Crotona of Old Hollywood, which was a theosophic retreat coming back to the first decades of the 20th century. So your book lives very comfortably in this genre, and I want to just congratulate you on that.
I have a very strong romantic attachment to Los Angeles before freeways, before smog, back when it was a small town where things were still possible. I feel really strongly about that. And there are times when I'm down and little glimpses of the Los Angeles that was, like going through the lower part of Beverly Hills when the jacaranda are in bloom, where I just feel like what it must have been like to be there, and how Elysian it really was.
Well, I like to think that some of it's still here if you know where to find it. I live in Beechwood Canyon under the sign, and I'm a commuter out to Malibu, and I'm still surfing. Certainly those kids at University High, going to that high school in that community at that time, with the pressure, without a Vietnam looming over their shoulders, it does feel just like a brief shining moment.
It's like the prom at University High in 1958 with Nelson Riddle, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's a kind of extraordinary time and place, perhaps like maybe the perfect time and place to be a teenager in America. It certainly has disappeared and was never going to be repeated.
As the wheel turned and this counterculture started to really emerge, and Vietnam is really blowing up in 66, 67, that they were left behind. I don't think the Beach Boys were, because at that point, with Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations, Brian Wilson is still, and I say this metaphorically, he's in his room, in my room. He's in such a private space of his own invention of fantasy and beauty, and it's like a lullaby that's so intimate and so personal that to me it still lives, it still resonates.
Well, of course, I don't think that Brian really was able to operate on anywhere near that level ever again after Good Vibrations.
No.
He used to come to mental illness. He spent like the next 3 years pretty much in his bedroom. And anything that he has done musically since then has really been sort of a reflection on his past glories. It's a personal struggle that I have a great deal of compassion for, but I wasn't interested in that as a piece of drama. I wanted to send him off the stage, having completed Good Vibrations, and not have to like let him experience all the.
Well, you get that close to the sun, and I mean he's operating at a Beethoven-like level in his genre. It's
Well, and as you suggest, it's not in a vacuum. He's surrounded by personal and professional pressures that were just very, very difficult for anybody to handle, especially someone with sort of Brian's limited abilities in that regard. And that he created on the level he did is even all the more amazing for that to be considered.
one of the things I really loved about your book. He's listening to the Beatles and he goes, "Fuck, he did that Rubber Soul! Holy shit! I want to top that!" And then he comes out with Pet Sounds and the Beatles, and what the hell did he do? Oh my God! This across the bond, cross-cultural competition between these two forces. I really love that part of the book. And
isn't it perfect that it's Bruce Johnston and his University High pal Kim Fowley that play the record to the Beatles in that hotel room in London?
it's beautiful in a way. It's like Nobody's an Island. There's so many great anecdotal things. I think they've tried to make a movie out of it. I've read somewhere. I don't know if it got made. The Frank Sinatra Jr. kidnapping in Lake Tahoe. It's like out of a. I mean, how that happens. It's almost.
Amazing.
It's hilarious, and Jan gives him some money to finance it. I don't know how.
It was Dean that was that.
Dean, right? Dean, not.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how he didn't get arrested. I have no idea. Today he would be.
It sort of feels like a felony and a high school prank at the same time. Like I was going to return the money. And they're all white kids, so it's okay. We'll make it work. Well,
you see, and in 1962. What you're 4 years out of high school, but Los Angeles is still a small town, so you're still involved in your high school antics, and yeah, I mean, Dean and Barry Keenan, the kidnapper, they made money in the stock market together, and they still held around. Not just Arrested Development. It's in the nature of small town life, which is what those guys on the West Side were living. They were living a small town life in Hollywood.
Yeah, it's a beautiful canvas, and it's a canvas that I still live in. I still enjoy the ocean, the waves, those mountains that lurk behind their homes. They're filled with wildlife.
Last time I was down, I had to take a meeting out in Sherman Oaks, and then I had to meet somebody in Malibu, and I had never driven over that part of the hills. And it was astonishing to see that there was that kind of topography that close into Los Angeles. The city never fails to amaze me.
Yeah, I mean, I get them. I live here in Beechwood Canyon. I jump on the freeway, zip through the valley, cut through Malibu Canyon, and wind my way through the canyon, pop through that tunnel, and then it crests, and then you can see the ocean. It's just a great feeling every time I see that. And I can always see, oh, there's a little white there. There's like three, oh, there's some surf, good, and go down and catch some waves. So,
You're living the life. You're living the California dream, man. That's what it is.
to
And,
certain,
you have to eke it out there because, I know you're driving down 101 to get there. And that's not the California dream anymore, is it?
no, I mean the freeways have carved up LA, but as long as I've been here, there've been freeways. I don't have a memory of a world without freeways. And I will say this, having grown up in Tarzana, which is Woodland Hills adjacent, going to Taft High School, that those mountains behind me to the south felt like they were the Himalayas. That's where the beach was. That's where Uni High is. And we were reminded of this because you would drive to the beach and in the canyons, there'd be spray painted on the stones as you drove by, Valley Go Home.
They were different cultures. And there's a little of that to this day, but the thing's been swamped.
LA has very little respect for its own past, and you have captured it beautifully, a cool kind of corner of it. And I want to invite anybody who's watching and listening to take the deeper dive and read this really excellent book, Hollywood Eden. I love the cover because it reminds me of an endless summer. It has that same kind of vibe. It looks like it could be Malibu or Topanga.
It's supposed to be State Beach.
Like each high school kind of had its own beach.
Yep.
So like my high school was Zuma Tower 10 or whatever it was. So we were at Zuma Beach, which the surf wasn't as good there. So the kids from Pali or Uni probably were by Will Rogers.
That's State Beach.
State Beach. Yeah, Will Rogers.
That's what they call it. We those of us from out of town know it as Will Rogers State Beach.
Right, but for them it's State.
Kids all call it State Beach.
Yeah, Leo Carrillo's called Secos. Yeah, each high school had a kind of a claim to the beach, but the surf spots, the high schools didn't claim that. You either could make it as a surfer and make that crew or not.
The hostility about surf spots continues to this day.
It does. It does. I mean, I surf at Malibu, and of course it's a public beach, but it's at the same time it's a private club. And I was hazed.
And there's some breaks at Malibu you can't get. You're not allowed on. I know that.
Well, I was hazed at all of them, so I have a pass. I'm good. I have a pass. So I've been hazed, brutalized, screamed at, and it's like, can you take it? Are you coming back? And that's sort of the game. And then it's fun. I mean, honestly, to me, it's fun. It's where I go, and it rescued my happiness because personally, I got sucked into this stand-up comedy, screenwriting, acting, pursuing this Hollywood bitch goddess, which, like all bitch goddesses, is not very generous with its tokens and affections. And when I started surfing, it was like, this ain't as tough as trying to get on at the Improv. All I got to do is be good. I'll get my waves. Hollywood was a far more treacherous endeavor. So I actually embraced the surf in Malibu because it felt way fairer to me than anything I had to deal with professionally on land.
I know what you mean. Stand-up comedians, they take it on stage with them every night, and then the battle is to take it back when they leave.
And I'm curious, has somebody written a book about the San Francisco comedy scene, out of the 80s, set lady? Of course, Robin is the biggest light, but that came out of that period. But there was a whole group of people, a lot of creativity in stand-up comedy, starting with Mort Saul, who has moved to Marin County. I did the Throckmorton Theater up there, which is in Mill Valley, a few years back, and I had known Mort Saul from here, so he lived there, so we had a beautiful dinner. He must be in his 90s now. But San Francisco has a very rich comedy scene going back to the Hungry Eye, really. And
Lenny Bruce and
right.
The Smothers Brothers and Phyllis Diller. All that's right out of San Francisco in the 50s. Along with the Kingston Trio and the Gateway Singers and all that. So there was a kind of rich cultural background there. And the comedy got buried in the 60s like everywhere else, but came back, as you suggest, in the 70s in nightclubs with people like Robin and guys that you don't hear much about. Do you remember A. Whitney Brown?
Of course. All
I
these
mean,
guys.
because he graduated from doing street stuff with his dog to doing nightclub stuff around San Francisco to writing all of Johnny Carson's best gags.
Yeah, Will Durst. I'm just thinking through my head
Will,
now.
you know, is recovering from a stroke.
I did not know that.
And he's somebody who never played the big time card. He stayed in San Francisco. He was determined to be a political commentator and to have an impact as a political commentator. So he kept his routine focused on our community locally here. Will's a remarkable guy. You know, but there's a ton of those sort of like guys you never heard of. They were kind of funny and it worked out there.
Yeah.
I mean, Dr. Gonzo went back to farming in Iowa.
Really?
Yeah, Pritchard runs motivational support groups for teenagers. You know, a lot of them are just have died now. I mean, it was a hard partying crowd. If you didn't have your nose in a bag of blow back then, you were not paying attention.
Oh yeah. When I started and came to LA from New York and I was like at the Comedy Store, it was like cocaine was what Bitcoin is today. It was an alternate currency, you know, for everything you wanted, you could trade for in cocaine. You know, it's like, I was afraid of it. I was like, I'm a wimpy Jewish kid. I don't do the drugs. Sorry, I just do the jokes, you know. A lot of people took a lot of tread off their tires in those years, you know.
Yeah, Robin always said it was God's way of telling you that you're making too much money.
Yeah, maybe. Well, he got that message loud and clear. I remember I was driving to the Throckmorton a couple of years ago, and it was, I don't know, I was going through one of the tunnels after the bridge, and it was the Robin Williams tunnel. And then I said, oh, that's interesting. Wow. And I got on stage, and I said, well, I just came up from San Francisco. I went through the Robin Williams tunnel. I go, at least there was light at the end of it.
I'll tell you something, Bill. I knew Robin real well for, you know, since before Mork and Mindy and all that.
Oh, wow.
And I just always loved being around Robin. Everybody did. And when what happened did, in an instant, every memory I had of being with Robin changed. And it went from seeing someone who was compassionately and irresistibly funny to someone who was desperately seeking some kind of sustenance. And it was just like, all it just took was that one click. And I went, oh my God, why didn't we see it? Well, we didn't see it. And I talked to Pritchard about this, who says, you know, now he says, we all have to be Robin now. And it was because he was so white light. He was so forceful. It came out of him with such velocity, like a fire hose, that you couldn't help but be swept up in it. And you never looked back to the emptiness and the anger and the desperation behind it. It just seemed like a natural rhythm that came out of him. But you know, he killed himself on a Sunday night, and I had friends who were in a AA meeting with him on Saturday night,
Mm-hmm.
and he was in great mood, cracking jokes, telling everybody how grateful he was for his sobriety and how wonderful his life was. And Lord, what a difference a day can make.
There's just so much mystery in the dark places sometimes. You just don't know. When I thought about Robin, I mean, I didn't know him from, I mean, I'd known him. He wasn't a friend by any standards, but God knows I'd seen him around, you know, in the clubs and talked to him on many occasions. And I just remember like hanging out at the Improv in LA, and then he would walk into the room. I've never seen anything like it in my life, the adulation. Like he was living on this, the fame, the adulation, the screaming laughter. I mean, it's like a rocket fuel injected into your arms. I didn't know how, I don't know how you could do that. I mean, it's so.
That wasn't his issue in San Francisco. That was not how he was treated here, and he was grateful for that. He would make fun of it, you know, like, oh, the last movie had some depth, Robin, you know. But no, he was old folks here, and he was welcome to use stages for his laboratory. And no, he did not get people pushed off stage when he walked in. He had to sit at the bar like everybody else. So no, that's what you're talking about is pure Hollywood shit.
Oh yeah, it was brutal.
Oh, brutal and soul destroying.
Like I suffered not because of Robin, but just for the whole scene was so harsh. But I often wondered, like, how how does he process that? It's so much. Like,
It
I don't know.
doesn't nourish you. It does not nourish you.
Yeah,
And the fact is that in Los Angeles, you're so inundated by that culture that it's really difficult to hold on to values you came into, about like the swamp and alligators. Whereas San Francisco, which Robin always called a human game preserve, always maintained the ability to be yourself. You could be Huey Lewis in the News, and Back to the Future could be the biggest movie in the world with your song opening it, but you still could go to the Safeway and push your cart around.
yeah, LA is different that way.
Can't do it.
And you went to high school in Berkeley. Did you go to Berkeley High?
Yeah. Yeah. I was supposed to have graduated in June 1967. I didn't quite cross the finish line.
Okay.
So I entered in fall of 64. And by the end of my freshman year in spring of 65, I'd already started taking LSD and going to the Fillmore Auditorium and dancing with the Grateful Dead. So my life was ruined.
I remember when I drove up to Berkeley in the fall of 74, I was desperate to get out of the suburban sameness that was the San Fernando Valley, the white suburban sameness. I wanted to be someplace where I thought it was happening, like things were going on. And there was a lot of white suburban parents didn't want their kids going to Berkeley. My parents didn't care. So I got in, and I was thrilled to be there. It was the year, I think Patty Hearst was still being abducted at that time. She was still in captivity. It was a great place to be, especially to understand about movies, because they had all these great old movie houses where.
Yeah, and they showed them on campus if it didn't go to Tele-Rep. Tele-Rep was started by Pauline Kael.
Right.
No, she and her husband, Ed Landsberg, ran that place in the 50s. And her first writing was doing the monthly program notes. Growing up in Berkeley was completely weird, because, there were three kids in my elementary school whose parents had won Nobel Prizes. My neighbor invented the H-bomb.
What would it be, Oppenheimer or something? Or
yeah, well, they developed the A-bomb. They were down the hill a little bit.
Yeah.
Miss Oppenheimer was a horticulturalist, and she had a hybrid pansy called the Oppenheimer pansy, which was sold out of only one nursery in the Berkeley Hills. And my mother had Oppenheimer pansies all over her backyard. Now, Ed Teller lived up the street. He's the father of the H-bomb.
Right.
Berkeley was just a strange sort of academic ghetto island of liberalism and foreign cars. Nobody had foreign cars in the 50s. Berkeley was full of them.
Ron Dellums.
So Ron was a city councilman when I was in high school. We knew.
Yeah,
Ron
didn't he become a
well.
congressman from there? I think he was.
Yeah, he was congressman for many years, causing so much trouble for the U.S. military.
Yeah.
And his secretary or his administrative assistant, Barbara Lee, carries on that tradition to this day. Love to see her get appointed to Feinstein's seat, but it'll never happen because she ain't serving out a term.
I wonder how Berkeley has informed the current vice president, Kamala.
Well, she grew up in the flats of Berkeley in her elementary years. By the time she was a teenager, she was off. But that was a very sort of lower middle class neighborhood. It was removed from the university. It was much more, the flatlands. In real provincial terms, those of us who grew up in the hills of Berkeley tended to see Berkeley as a small town bounded by Shattuck and Ashby. So it was like this one quadrant of the town. And the rest of it, which was this flatland area, was much more different culture than there weren't a lot of Nobel Prize winners scattered around Blake Street where Kamala grew up.
Well, that's similarly like to the canvas on this book. Those kids in the hills had a different viewpoint and a reality than those that were in the flats, of Santa Monica or specifically the South Bay, which was way more working class than the hills of Brentwood, and to this day probably the same. Hey, Joel, this has been really fun, man. I hope we can do this in person.
I really enjoyed our talk, and it's great to meet you this way, and we'll look forward to further associations.
Absolutely. And folks, one last reminder, you can download this book. I'm sure it's on Apple Books and all the downloadable portals. I'm grateful to have it in my hand because any friend of Gidget's is a friend of mine. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And this book joins a really cool group of books that are shedding light on the rich cultural history of La La Land. So
I appreciate all your fine words. Thank you, Bill.
Take care. Thank you. Till next time, I always say this, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. Thanks, Joel. See you next time. So appreciate it.